Shortly after we had gained our position, either supposing that the bridge was abandoned by the retirement of the light company, or because their courage was wound up to proper fighting pitch, the French cavalry advanced at a quick trot down the hill. Our guns instantly wheeled out upon the road and played upon their column until they became screened from their fire by the dip in the road as they approached the bridge. Here, they were warmly received by the 52nd Regiment, now freed from our own dragoons, and the 95th, and upon this they made a most furious charge at full speed over the bridge and up the road towards our position. During this onset, they were severely galled by the 95th, who by this time had lined the hedges on either side of the road within a few yards of their flanks, and by the light company immediately in their front, whom it was evidently their intention to break through as they rode close to our bayonets. But their ranks being much thinned by the destructive flanking fire of the rifles and of the standing ranks of the light company, their charge was vain, and, their gallant leader having fallen close under our bayonets, they wheeled about and underwent the same ordeal in retiring, so that but few survived to tell the tragic tale. The road was absolutely choked with their dead. One alone among the slain was sincerely regretted, their gallant leader, General Colbert. His martial appearance, noble figure, manly gesture, and above all his daring bravery, called forth the admiration of all. I say that one only was regretted, for the wanton cruelties committed against the women and children on the previous day were too recent to be either forgotten or forgiven. This attack of the French cavalry was most ill-advised, ill-judged, and seemingly without any final object in view. It is true that their bravery was too obvious to be doubted, but they rushed on reckless of all opposition, whether apparent or probable, and had they succeeded in cutting through the light company, which they would have found some difficulty in doing, and although they would then have escaped much of the crossfire of the 95th, yet they would have been in a worse position than before. When they had passed beyond the light company 100 yards, they would have encountered the left wing of the 28th Regiment, supported, if necessary, by the right wing directly on their flank, although a little in the rear, and had their number, which was but from 400 to 500 men, been quadrupled, every man must have been shot, bayoneted, or taken prisoner. In fact, there is no calculating what amount of cavalry would be sufficient to force an infantry regiment formed in column on a road flanked with a high hedge on either side. I speak of British infantry, among whom no swerving takes place, each individual being well aware that his greatest safety depends on his manfully facing and strenuously opposing the foe. At this time, the commander of the forces arrived, having left Villafranca as soon as he heard the report of the first gun fired. He immediately withdrew the 52nd Regiment, who, as I have stated, were a good way in front of our left, and placed them on the high ground towards the centre of our position. Sir John Moore did not at all differ from General Paget as to the strength of the position, but their intentions differed. Paget took up the best possible position which the nature of the ground offered to maintain a battle, however prolonged. Sir John Moore perceived that both flanks of the 52nd were liable to be turned, especially after the light company had retired from the bridge, which would more than probably bring on a general action of the whole reserve. This he studiously avoided, and for the best possible reasons. He was ignorant as to the amount of force with which the enemy were advancing against our position, but from all accounts he was led to believe that it was very great, and at that time our nearest division, that of Sir David Baird, was at Nogales, distant nearly 40 miles. Not long after the failure of the charge headed by General Colbert, some French dragoons, together with their light troops, crossed the Guia under the high ground occupied by our right and centre. They were opposed by the 95th, who moved from the hedges which flanked the road to meet them, and a severe skirmish ensued. The enemy's cavalry, who on this occasion mixed with their skirmishers, were fast gaining ground on the right of the rifles, The bugles from the positions sounded the retreat, but were very imperfectly obeyed. Some of the 52nd Regiment, who could no longer restrain their feelings at seeing the critical situation in which their old friends were placed, darted forward from their position above to their assistance, and the 28th Light Company, making a partial extension along the hedge which flanked the road upon which they were stationed, sent many an effectual shot in their aid. The fight now became confused, and the enemy's numbers increased every instant. Cavalry, tirailleurs, voltigeurs, 95th, and those of the 52nd Regiment who flew to the aid of their friends, now formed one indiscriminate mass, and the Light Company on the road could no longer fire except at the dragoons' heads, some few of whom were lowered. It stung us to the heart to see our gallant comrades so maltreated with aid so near, for had we of the Light Company crossed the hedge under which we were drawn up, and advanced a short way in regular order so as to form a point d'appui, all would have been put to rights. But we durst not move an inch, being posted close to our guns for their protection, and every moment expecting to encounter another charge of cavalry. At this time, General Merle's division appeared on the hills in front of our position, and moved forward. The reserve now showed themselves, probably with a view of inducing the enemy to delay their attack until the morning. A heavy column of the enemy were pushed forward towards the left of our position, in front of where the 52nd Regiment had been posted. Their intention was evidently to cross the stream, but their column soon becoming unveiled, our guns again wheeled out onto the road and opened such a destructive fire that although close to the Gaia, they hastily retired after having sustained considerable loss. Had the 52nd remained as first posted, the carnage in the column must have been immense. But it is probable that the enemy were aware of that regiment having shifted ground, for they sent no skirmishers in front of their column. The skirmish, hitherto sharply maintained by the 95th and 52nd against their opponents, now slackened and shortly ceased. The French tirailleurs and cavalry, perceiving the failure of their infantry attack on our left, and that they were fast retiring, retired also down to the banks of the Guia. It being now quite dark, our guns were withdrawn up to the main body of the reserve and were followed by the Light Company. The 95th also fell back onto the main body, and, leaving strong piquets along the line, the whole force moved on towards Villafranca. Everything was now quiet, with the exception of a few shots fired from the bank of the stream in answer to some few of the 95th, who still remained behind, and, although without any cause, persisted in continuing to fire, exposing themselves by the flashes. Indeed, it was more difficult to withdraw our men from the fight than to loose the hold of a high-bred mastiff. I have told already how during the hottest part of the skirmish, the bugles from the position sounded the retreat, which was not at all, or at most, but imperfectly obeyed. At this period of the retreat, the reserve were always closely pursued and harassed by the enemy, without their having an opportunity of revenge, and this, from their being unaccustomed to campaigning, wrought them up to a pitch of excitement amounting to frenzy. They suffered privations, and were at the same time exposed to temptations which to British soldiers not habituated to the presence of an enemy were irresistible. Wine lay in their way, and in abundance, forsaken too by its owners. Thus it was that, when on this day the French infantry first came in close contact with ours, when bayonets were crossed and blood was profusely drawn, our men were so wild and hot for the fray that it was hard to drag them from the field. That Britons will fight to the last, that is, while they can stand, is well known, and it was this determination that caused Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo to say that the English were beaten according to every rule of war, but did not know it. Long may they remain in this species of ignorance, and, whether feasted, flushed, or fasting, continue to maintain their true national character, a specimen of which was given at Calcabellos. Some there were who fought with stomachs full, many more with stomachs empty, and some there were who, if true men, gave proof of their veracity in wine. Thus terminated the first encounter, which took place between the reserve and the foremost columns of the French infantry. It was conjectured that upwards of 500 men must have fallen, killed and wounded, in both armies. The loss sustained by General Merle's division could not be ascertained. Calculating, however, from the depth of the column, the fitness of the range for the practice of our guns, and the celerity with which they retired, it must have been severe. But the greatest loss was in their cavalry, a just retribution for their wanton cruelty at Bembibre. Gratified by this preface to our future work, our morals improved by the justly merited punishment which we received that morning, refreshed by the clean sheets of driven snow upon which we had reposed, and our frames more braced than benumbed by the cold to which our own irregularities had doomed us, we pressed forward like soldiers upon whom the light of conviction had flashed, and to whom physical powers were not wanting, and so marched that night to Hererias, a distance of 18 miles, and, if I mistake not, without leaving a single straggler of our division behind. The reserve again became disciplined soldiers, determined to prove themselves such. They gave their word of honour as soldiers to their general that they would reform, and this too, while the enemy were pressing forward to bear testimony to this pledge, by the fulfilment of which they were to become the principal sufferers. It was at this time currently reported that the cause of our sudden night march from Cambaros to Bembibre was a false alarm given to our cavalry, stating that Napoleon had entered Astorga that evening, December 31st, and was pushing forward his columns. This, of course, rendered it necessary for the reserve immediately to retire, Cambaros being scarcely 2 leagues from Astorga. The groundlessness of this alarm became apparent through more certain information and succeeding events. It was fully ascertained that Napoleon did not enter Astorga until the afternoon of next day, January 1st. False alarms must be expected in all campaigns, but more particularly in such a campaign as ours. In this instance, the alarm proved very injurious to us. The night march of the reserve pushed on unnecessarily, harassed them a good deal, which, added to the manner in which they were employed next day in rousing the stragglers, caused them to leave many men behind in Bembibre, and had Sir David Baird's division not been started up long before daybreak to make way for the reserve, but allowed to take some few hours more repose to give the men time to sleep away, the fumes of the wine swallowed during the previous evening, some hundreds of stragglers would have been saved to the army. On leaving Calcabelos 3 or 4 miles behind, we approached Villafranca. The whole town seemed on fire. This conflagration was caused by the destruction of stores and provisions, and so tenacious were the commissaria in preserving everything for the flames that they had guards posted around, even the biscuits and salt meat, to prevent the men as they passed from taking anything away. A commissary or one of his satellites stood close to each sacrifice, who exhorted the officers, as they passed, to use every exertion in preventing any diminution of the sumptuous repast prepared for the hungry flames and grudged to the hungry soldiers. But notwithstanding these precautions and strict orders and the chastisement received in the morning, many of the men had the hardihood, as they passed, to stick their bayonets, and sergeants their pikes, into the salt pork which was actually being set fire to. Several junks were thus taken away, and many of the officers who cut and slashed at the men to prevent such sacrilege against the Commissaria Autodafé were very thankful that night at Hererias to get a small portion of the salt meat thus carried off. At this place we arrived about a couple of hours before daybreak on the morning of the 4th. Being a good deal fatigued, we halted to take some rest. But as soon as the genial light of morning diffused its renovating influence over wearied mortals, we pressed forward for Nogales, distant from 18 to 20 miles. During this day's march, the misery and suffering attendant on wanton disorders and reckless debauchery among the men were awfully manifested. Some were lying dead along the road, and many apparently fast approaching a similar fate. Cavalry horses, too, were continually being shot. One circumstance I shall mention, which roused every feeling both of humanity and indignation. About 7 or 8 miles from Herrerius, seeing a group of soldiers lying in the snow, I immediately went forward to rouse them up and send them on to join their regiments. The group lay close to the roadside. On my coming up, a sad spectacle presented itself. Through exhaustion, depravity, or a mixture of both, 3 men, a woman and a child, all lay dead, forming a kind of circle, their heads inwards. In the centre were still the remains of a pool of rum made by the breaking of a cask of that spirit. The unfortunate people must have sucked more of the liquor than their constitutions could support. Intoxication was followed by sleep, from which they awoke no more. They were frozen to death. This was one of the closing scenes, brought on by the disgraceful drunkenness and debaucheries committed at Villafranca during the previous 2 or 3 days. Being marked with peculiar circumstances, the scene is still fresh before me. Whilst I was contemplating the miseries and depravities of human nature and paying no heed to the frequent discharge of pistols by our dragoons, I was aroused by hearing my name and recognized an old acquaintance, Captain Bennet, of the 95th. He rode slowly and was much bent over his saddle-bow, suffering severely from a wound received the previous evening at Calcabello's. He bore up stoutly, notwithstanding his sufferings, which were manifold. His mind was afflicted with thoughts of his family. He dreaded falling into the hands of the advancing foe, and the bodily pain which he was suffering may be imagined, as he had ridden upwards of 25 miles with a musket ball in his groin during a freezing night through a country covered with snow. Poor Bennet! The only assistance which I could then afford was to give him a silk pocket handkerchief, which I placed between his wounded side and the saddle. Yet little as this assistance was, it added to his ease, which he more gratefully acknowledged than the trifling incident merited. The slaughter of the horses continued throughout the day. They were led to the last by the dragoons, who then, whilst unable to restrain their manly tears, became the unwilling executioners of these noble animals, which had so lately and so powerfully contributed to their heroic deeds, and with a martial spirit equal to that of the gallant riders whom they bore irresistibly against the foe. Upon my inquiring of the men how it was that horses in apparently tolerable condition were incapable of at least proceeding quietly along, the invariable answer which I received was, that from the roughness of the road, hardened by continued frost, they cast their shoes, and that they had not a nail to fasten on those picked up, nor a shoe to replace those lost. And they added that there was not a spare nail or shoe in any of the forge carts, which retired with the cavalry. This appeared the more strange as the cavalry were the previous day at Herrerius, the forges, so called from the number of blacksmiths' workshops there found. In fact, the greater part of the town consisted of forges. In one of these, some of us were quartered during the few hours we halted on the preceding night, and there we partook of our sumptuous repast, consisting of a little salt pork and biscuit served upon a massive plate, a blacksmith's anvil, and in place of a superfluous nutcracker, there was a sledgehammer to smash the flinty biscuit. This day's march was much retarded through our endeavours to rouse the stragglers forward, who were very numerous, all left behind by the leading divisions. Added to this, we were compelled to await the 95th Regiment, whom we had left when we retired from our position at Calcabellos late on the previous evening. Piquets of the 95th were left to occupy all the approaches leading to the position, and the regiment halted some way in their rear for support. The piquets were repeatedly attacked during the early part of the night by strong patrols. Although they lost some men, killed and wounded, they firmly maintained their posts, always beating back the enemy, who invariably retired in total ignorance as to whether the reserve had evacuated or still maintained their position. Towards the end of the night, The piquets, according to orders previously received, fell back on their regiment, who now followed the track of the division. As far as Herrerias, all was safe for them, as well from the darkness of the night as the start they had of a few hours before the enemy discovered their retirement. After Herrerias, precautions became necessary. The 95th were a rifle regiment. Rifles and swords were not so efficient as muskets and bayonets to resist an attack of cavalry, and our last cavalry guard had passed to the rear early on the preceding evening. We were therefore obliged to make occasional halts to allow the rifles nearer approach to efficient support. During these halts, the men lay down in martial wedlock, each folding to his breast his better half, his musket, and thus enjoyed more repose than they would have done in triple the time if regularly marched into quarters. For when soldiers come into a town, they become curious travellers and search very minutely for desirable objects. Not that I rank them as antiquarian virtuosi, since soldiers care rather for the new and fresh than that rendered venerable by old age, and for quantity more than quality. A bucketful of common blackstrap even would by them be preferred to a lesser portion, though it should be of the true old Falernian, and a new polished dollar more highly estimated than a dusky old medal or coin, although its antiquity should bear date even as far back as the days of the first Darius. In the evening, as dusk approached, and within 2 or 3 miles of Nogales, we fell in with some Spanish clothing, shoes and arms. The carts which contained these articles were totally abandoned. There were neither mules, muleteers, nor guards. Our men immediately commenced an inspection of necessaries, and the officers, I know not why, repeated the same opposition as at Villafranca. But in this instance the soldiers, many of whom were severely suffering from want of shoes, were not so easily deceived, and carried away many pairs of these absolutely necessary articles, and also several pairs of trousers and other clothing. At length we arrived at Nogales long after dark. By this forced march we made amends for the day we halted at Calcabelos to cover Villafranca during the destruction of such stores as could not be removed, as well as to push forward the numerous stragglers. It also enabled us to regain our proper echelon distance from the leading columns. In this place we were very reluctantly received by the inhabitants, so much so that in most instances we were compelled to break open the doors to get under shelter, for the owners had either fled or concealed themselves to the last moment. This latter was the case at the house upon which I, with the light company of the 28th, was billeted. To force a Spanish door is not easy. They have large nails driven through the panels at small intervals. These nails, or rivets, have heads on the outer side of the doors nearly the size of a half-crown piece. And the doors are very massive, made of hard wood, generally oak, so that striking against them with the butt ends of the muskets was totally useless. On this occasion, after knocking for some time to no purpose, we took a large stone, and putting it into a sergeant's sash, 4 men stood close to the door supporting the sash, which formed a kind of sling. Others pulled away the stone as far as the length of the sash permitted, and then, adding all their force to its return, sent it with a tremendous bump-bang against the door. After we, for I acted engineer on the occasion, had repeated this mode of rapping 5 or 6 times, the door became uneasy on its hinges, and the master of the house put his head out of a window as if just awakened, and began to remonstrate loudly against the outrage, upon which some of the men, in their desperation, threatened to shoot him at the window, and I believe that, had his remonstrances continued much longer, I should have found it difficult to prevent their carrying the threat into execution. However, it could not have been held malice prepense, since the muskets were always loaded, and as to manslaughter or justifiable homicide, they were practising it every hour. The door being at length wheeled back on its tottering hinges, we hurried into the house, and so uncouth were we, under such circumstances, fatigued, fasting, and freezing, that before we inquired after the master's health, the welfare of his wife and family, or whether he had any such, he was closely interrogated as to the state of his larder and cellar. It is lucky that we were even so far courteous, as it was the last house we entered during the retreat. By we, I mean the reserve, always considering ourselves distinct from the clodhoppers, a term given by our men to the leading divisions, who were always from 1 to 3 days' march ahead, as we advanced to the rear. Soon after we entered our billets, we all became on the best terms with the landlord, who treated us very liberally. But notwithstanding our not getting under cover until a late hour, being excessively fatigued and feeling certain that we should be engaged with the enemy as soon as the morning dawned, yet the men, except for their uniforms, resembled more a party of sportsmen after a long day's pleasant hunt than soldiers after a long and harassing march. The officers being obliged to lie down in the same apartment with the men, we were condemned to listen to their rough jokes and loud repartees, which under the circumstances were excessively unseasonable and annoying. Gentleman Roach, a title given to him from his continually boasting of a long line of ancestors, was on this night more than usually facetious. He certainly had received an education far above his present station, but he did not rank among the best soldiers of the light company, not being a stout marcher, rather inclined to be a lawyer, and fighting his battles more poignantly with his tongue than with his bayonet. His incessant chatter annoyed the whole company, who, being anxious to enjoy a little repose, upbraided him for his loquacity. Being no longer able to bear with his noise and vanity, which always bent towards pride of ancestry, one of the men interrupted him by crying out, "Bad luck to you and all your ancestors put together. I wish you'd hold your jaw, and let us lie quiet a little bit before the day comes, for we can hardly hold up our heads with the sleep." The gentleman always put on his mettle at the mention of his ancestors, with indignant voice exclaimed, "Wretch, you personify all the disproportions of a vulgar cabbage plant, the dense foliage of whose plebeian head is too ponderous for its ignoble crouching stem to support." "Faith, then," replied the plebeian, "I wish we had a good hide of cabbage to eat now, and we'd give you the shrinking part. That's like yourself, good for nothing and not able to stand when wanted. And damn your sowl, what are you like? Always talking about your rotten old ancestors. Sure, if you were any good yourself, you wouldn't be always calling them to take your part. Be jabers, you're like a pratie, for all your worth in the world is what's down in the ground." "Contemptible creature," replied the gentleman. "If even the least of my noble line of ancestors were to rise from the grave, he would display such mighty feats of arms as would astound you and all the vulgar herd of which you appear to be the appropriate leader." The conclusion of this contemptuous speech, being accompanied with a revolving glance, and his right arm put into semicircular motion, including all the men as it passed through its orbit, brought him many adversaries. One of his new antagonists bellowed out with a loud laugh, "Bury him! Bury him!" Since all the bravery that belongs to him is with his old dads in the ground, maybe, if we buried him a little while to make an old ancestor of him too, and then dug him up again, he might be a good soldier himself. "Arrah, sure it's no use," cried out another, "to be loosing your talk with a dancing master like him. Wasn't he squeezed up behind a tree, like the back of an old Cremona fiddle, while I was bothering 3 Johnny Craps when they were running down screaming like Pelibines to charge the bridge? And, after all that, I'll engage with his rotten old ancestors that when we goes home, he'll have a better pension than me, or be made a sergeant by some fine colonel that always stays at home and knows nothing at all about a good soldier." At this period of the noisy orgies, the night being far advanced, with no chance of repose owing to the loud laughter, a man of the company, who was always looked upon as a kind of mentor, at length interposed, and by some admirable and personal arguments put an end to the noisy revels. How little the minds of soldiers on service are occupied with thoughts of the enemy from the moment they are separated from them may plainly be seen by the merriment which they enjoyed during the greater part of this night, and how reckless they are of the manner in which they will be employed next day, and how completely their hardships and fatigues are forgotten as soon as terminated, was also made clear on that same night. For although we had been for the previous 4 days and nights either marching or fighting or outlying piquets in the snow, yet some of the light company returned back nearly 3 miles to where the carts containing the Spanish clothing were abandoned, in the hope of procuring more shoes, thus voluntarily adding a night march of 6 miles to the most fatiguing march which took place during the whole campaign. The shoes thus procured, as well as those carried away previous to our entering the town, were regularly distributed among the company, which enabled the men to march stoutly next day. They, who carried off some 3, 4, or 5 pairs of shoes, supplied those who were so unfortunate as not to have been enabled to carry away any. But the shoes were not given as presents. They were sold at high prices on promise of payment at Corunna or on arriving in England. Some of those promissory notes became post obits next evening along the road to Constantino, and many more shared the same fate before and at the Battle of Corunna. Having been somewhat refreshed by our short repose at Nogales, we commenced our march on the morning of the 5th about daybreak. But scarcely was darkness succeeded by light when the fight again commenced, and continued until darkness again returned. For as soon as the enemy discovered on the morning of the 4th that the reserve had retired during the previous night from the position which they occupied at Calcabellos, they had pushed forward, and by a forced march arrived at Nogales before daybreak on the 5th. Our skirmish with their cavalry, who all carried long carbines, was rather sharp during the morning, but at a few miles' distance from Nogales, as we approached a beautiful bridge, the skirmish became much more lively. This bridge, the name of which I do not recollect, presented a most romantic appearance. It was situated close to the foot of a hill. The stream immediately after passing through the bridge, suddenly winding round the base of the high ground on the opposite bank, was entirely screened from our view as we approached the bridge, thus giving its numerous arches the appearance of so many entrances to subterranean caverns beneath the mountains, into which the current rushed. On the opposite bank and not far from the bridge, the road assumed a zigzag course, and to have allowed the enemy, who were fast increasing in numbers, to come too near would have subjected our men to a destructive fire while ascending this meandering road. To avoid this general paget marched quickly across, and having surmounted the zigzag road, halted just beyond range of musket shot from the opposite bank. He then ordered the guns to be unlimbered and the horses removed to the rear, and the division then moved on, leaving the guns apparently abandoned. At this bridge, we found a party of engineers endeavouring to destroy it, but as the stream was fordable on either side, the party were sent to the rear to practice their art elsewhere. We remained at our post beyond the bridge for about an hour, during which, although the firing continued, it became more slack. The enemy held back, evidently awaiting reinforcements, yet they were continually pushing small parties across the fords. General Paget, who sat the whole time on a slope where the light company were posted in sight of the bridge, anxiously awaiting any attack which might be made to capture the guns, and seeing the passage at the fords, addressed me, saying, "You are a younger man than I am. Run up that hill." Rather on our flank, and round it the stream ran, and see what force the enemy have collected on the other side. I instantly started off, and returning as quickly as possible, reported that the enemy on this bank were from 200 to 300 men, infantry and cavalry, but that they were collecting in greater force on the opposite side. The general merely remarked, "It is no matter. and ordered the guns to be horsed, saying, "These fellows don't seem inclined to add to their artillery." Had they indeed taken the guns, which I believe it was the intention of the general to permit, they could never have been more warmly received, and they would have paid most dearly for their momentarily held prize. The light company were posted behind a low hedge immediately on the flank of the guns. The grenadiers were drawn up about 100 yards in their rear. The remainder of the regiment, 28th, were posted at an appropriate distance in rear of their grenadiers, ready to push forward, and our gallant general was present to animate and direct. The guns being horsed were immediately sent forward to join the main body of the reserve, who by this time had got a start of 4 or 5 miles, to gain which advantage was the principal object of our halt. But General Paget, perceiving the great number of the enemy coming upon him, and his flank partly turned, judged it prudent to delay no longer, the more especially as he had but one regiment with him in the rear. We therefore lost no time in following the guns. The general, observing our disappointment at the reluctance of the enemy to come forward to attack us, took a pinch of snuff out of his buff leather waistcoat pocket, and said, "28th, if you don't get fighting enough, it is not my fault." Scarcely had we moved when a column of the enemy crossed the bridge in perfect order. Their light troops, together with those who forded in the morning, were soon close to our rear, when the skirmish resumed its lively character, which was incessant during several miles' march. Hurrying our pace about noon, and thus gaining a mile or two ahead of our pursuers, we halted on the road, we of the light company only, at a place where we could only be attacked in front, and that by a strong force. We therefore threw out no flankers. The mountain on our left, as we turned round to face the enemy, was stupendous, covered with snow, and rose nearly perpendicularly from where we stood. On our right the precipice was very deep, its steepness bearing proportion to the sudden rise of the mountain above. The enemy, seeing it impossible to force us in front until their heavy columns should come up, sent their voltigeurs and some cavalry into the valley low down on our right to turn that flank, an operation attended with many difficulties. The country being deeply covered with snow, the inequalities of the ground were undiscoverable to the eye, and it afforded us much amusement to see men and horses tumbling head over heels as they advanced through the valley. It was during this short halt that an officer wearing a blue coat rode up from our rear. We faced the enemy, and on his inquiring for General Paget, some men of the company sent him forward to me for an answer. Upon his coming up, he addressed me by saying, "Pray, sir, where is General Paget?" As the general was not 5 yards distant, leaning against the wall of the road, and heard the demand as plainly as I did, I considered it would be indecorous in me to make any reply. The officer with the blue coat repeated his question rather hastily, and for the reason already mentioned, I remained silent. The general then stood up, and putting on his hat, said, "I am General Paget, sir. Pray, what are your commands?" By a partial closing of one of the general's eyes, I discovered a small shadow under the inner corner of its lower lid, which, although it did not prophesy a raging monsoon, yet clearly indicated severe weather not far distant. "Oh, beg pardon, sir," said the blue-coat officer. "I am Paymaster General and—" "Oh!" Here he was interrupted by the general, who, advancing 1 or 2 paces towards him, said in a voice not to be mistaken, "A light, sir." The gentleman complied, yet apparently as if he did not see the absolute necessity of so doing, then repeating that he was or the Paymaster General, I forget which, continued by saying, "The treasure of the army, sir, is close in the rear, and the bullocks being jaded are unable to proceed. I therefore want fresh animals to draw it forward." "Pray, sir," said the general, "do you take me for a bullock driver or a muleteer, or knowing who I am, have you the presence of mind coolly to tell me that through a total neglect or ignorance of your duty, you are about to lose the treasure of the army committed to your charge, which, according to your account, must shortly fall into the hands of that enemy, and he pointed to the French advanced guard, who were closing upon us. "Had you, sir, the slightest conception of your duty, you would have known that you ought to be a day's march ahead of the whole army, instead of hanging back, with your foundered bullocks and carts, upon the rearmost company of the rearguard, and making your report, too, at the very moment when that company is absolutely engaged with the advancing enemy. What, sir? To come to me and impede my march with your carts, and ask me to look for bullocks when I should be free from all encumbrances, and my mind occupied by no other care than that of disposing my troops to the best advantage in resisting the approaching enemy. It is doubtful, sir, whether your conduct can be attributed to ignorance and neglect alone." There were other expressions equally strong, which are now in part forgotten. Yet the words, "ought to be hanged," have been hanging on my memory for many years. While the sterling and the pound sterling generals were thus giving and getting, the enemy were creeping round our right flank. Soult's heavy columns were closely approaching in front, and their balls coming amongst us obliged us to retire. I thought at the time that the general prolonged his discourse to give the man of money an opportunity of witnessing how the rearguard were generally occupied, and to show him the different use of silver and lead during a campaign. We now retired, and soon came up to the treasure, contained in 2 carts lugged by foundered bullocks, moving so slowly as to render motion scarcely visible even in the wheels. The light company were now ordered to the rear in double quick time, to a village called, I think, Gallegos, about 2 miles distant, there to refresh and halt until called for. This order, although we had been fighting since daybreak, rather astonished and mortified us, but General Paggi formed a pretty correct idea as to how we were to be employed during the remainder of the day. As the light company passed to the rear, the regiment were drawn up close to the carts, and preparation commenced for the fall of the dollars. As they rolled down the precipice, their silvery notes were accompanied by a noble bass, for 2 guns were thundering forth their applause into Soult's dark brown column as they gallantly pressed forward. After the money had been thus disposed of, and the enemy's column for a short time checked, the regiment and the guard of the treasure, consisting of a subaltern's party of the 4th or King's Own, passed to the rear. The light company by this time had had a halt of upwards of an hour, during which time we had some little repose and sparingly partook of our frugal fare. But our moderation arose more from economy than care of health, of which there was no necessity, for scarcely had the regiment and guard of the 4th regiment got clear through the village when our old friends came up and liberally supplied us with their pale blue digesting pills. We were instantly under arms, and the fight proceeded and was well maintained on either side during several miles without the slightest intermission, until we came to a low hill within little more than musket shot of the village of Constantino. On this hill, the artillery attached to the reserve were embattled. The 95th Regiment were drawn up in line on either side, and one company advanced in loose order to cover the front. The road itself was now occupied by the 28th Light Company, close to the guns, being the only bayonets present. From this position, the road descended suddenly in semicircular direction down to the bridge which separated us from Constantino, a village built on the slope of another hill beyond the stream. To arrive at this further hill, the road from the bridge assumed a winding zigzag course. Against our position on this side of the stream, the enemy's light troops continued to advance and became warmly engaged with the company of the 95th thrown forward. But on their heavy column coming up and gaining a full view of our position, they came to a halt, which continued for some time, a most fortunate circumstance, for at this juncture the main body of the reserve were passing over the bridge and wending their way up the zigzag road leading to the summit of the hill on the opposite bank, on which, as soon as gained, they were placed in position by Sir John Moore himself. Had the enemy's heavy column, who were close behind their skirmishers, pushed gallantly forward, which they would have been fully borne out in doing from their numbers, they must have forced our guns and the 95th down to the bridge, and by occupying the near bank of the stream, which was very high, they would have been enabled to fire within pistol shot into the retiring columns, and this must have caused the greatest confusion and loss. Having at length gained confidence from increasing numbers, or feeling ashamed to delay their attack, the column, doubling its skirmishers, moved forward at the very moment when, the reserve having gained the opposite bank, our guns were withdrawn and passed us in a sharp trot down towards the bridge. The 95th and the Light Company now began also to withdraw, but scarcely had we left the position which we held when the French cavalry occupied it. Their numbers were every moment increasing, but, knowing that our guns had not as yet gained the opposite ridge, we retired with measured step. During our movement towards the bridge, the cavalry frequently evinced an inclination to charge the Light Company on the road. But seeing the beautiful manner in which the 95th retired, close on either flank of the road through thickly planted vineyards, amongst which a horse could scarcely move, and knowing the murderous fire which that gallant corps would have poured forth had the cavalry attacked the Light Company, who with stern aspect were prepared to receive them, the horsemen declined to give us the honour of a charge. We now approached the bridge, and the 95th, closing from the flanks, came onto the road, which here narrowed and wound so suddenly towards the bridge and so close that the bank being much above its level, it lay concealed until approached within a few yards. The Light Company now halted, and forming across the road as deep as our strength permitted, faced the cavalry. They also halted, and the 95th, favoured by the sudden turn, wheeled round and quickly crossed the bridge unperceived. We now fully expected that the affair would terminate in a trial of bayonets and sabres. But although the cavalry seemed preparing for a charge, yet doubtful as to our true position, and not knowing what had become of our guns or of the 95th, and dreading an ambuscade such as was prepared for them in the morning, they hesitated and remained firm. The Light Company now wheeled round, and with a quick but orderly pace crossed the bridge unmolested. By this time the reserve had occupied their new position. The bank, which we had just gained, was lined down to the water's edge by the 95th and other light troops, the end of the bridge strongly defended, and our guns admirably posted. All this preparation was closely seen by the enemy, and yet it was only now that they came forward in force and resolute in attack. In fact, the warfare at the bridge seemed a revival of that courteous chivalry renowned in olden times, when the advancing army delayed their attack until their opponents should be prepared to resist the assault. As their dense column, preceded by the sharpshooters and cavalry, pushed forward to assail the bridge, they suffered severely from our guns, which, being advantageously posted above them, had open play and beautiful practice at the column, and the sharpshooters and cavalry who mounted the bridge were instantly shot, which caused all their attacks to fail. On this day, the whole reserve presented a rather curious appearance, in consequence of their being partially clad with the raiment which they had snatched from the Spanish carts the previous night. I recollect that Lieutenant Cadell, of the 28th Regiment, now Lieutenant Colonel, cut a hole in a blanket, through which he thrust his head, and thus marched the whole day. Being a tall man, a grenadier, his appearance was afterwards called to mind when we saw the shepherds clad in sheepskins crossing the Pyrenean mountains on stilts. But the Light Company of the 28th Regiment, being better supplied, in consequence of their nocturnal visit to the carts from Nogales, appeared more diversified in their dress than any others. Grey trousers, blue trousers, and white breeches were promiscuously seen. Some wore black shoes, some white, and many there were who wore shoes of both colours. This being the company whom the enemy had in view almost the whole day, they may have been led to imagine that we were all mixed up with the stragglers from Romana's army, but their variety of dress affected neither the resolution nor discipline of the reserve, and after 3 successive rushes which the enemy vainly made, cavalry and infantry uniting to force their way over the bridge, they returned each time under a thorough conviction that they had been received by British troops alone, British to a nerve. The fighting at the bridge continued. About dusk, the main body of the reserve retired, leaving piquets and a strong supporting party to defend the passage. The piquets maintained an incessant fire with the enemy on the opposite end of the bridge, so long as either party could distinguish the other. Darkness intervening, the firing ceased. After remaining quiet for some time and lighting our fires, and no movement being perceived on the opposite bank, the piquets and supports were silently withdrawn about 11:30 o'clock, and followed the track of the main body, whom we joined about dawn on march to Lugo. This morning's march was heavy, for the enemy's cavalry alone having come up and keeping rather distant, the men complained of not having an enlivening shot to break the dreary monotony. However, we were soon gratified by seeing the whole British army in position about 3 miles in front of Lugo. We marched through the brigade of guards, who were for the most part in their shirts and trousers, and in the act of cooking. All their appointments swung airily from the branches of trees. As we passed, some of the officers asked Major Brown if we had heard anything of the French. "I'll tell you what, my honest lads," replied Brown. "You had better take down your pipe-clayed belts from those trees, put them on, and eat your dinners, if you have any, as quick as you can. Otherwise, you may not have an opportunity of finishing them." The guards laughed with an air of incredulity. We marched on, but had not proceeded half a mile, when we heard our guns, which were placed in the position mentioned, open on the advancing enemy. We now laughed in our turn at the guards, and continued our march to Lugo, where we arrived about 2 o'clock in the afternoon.